For months he waited, rain, snow, and blazing sun, his eyes locked on the train station's entrance. Everyone pitied the lonely German shepherd, until the chilling truth finally came to light. The train station had always been a place of movement, people rushing to catch the morning commute, others arriving home from distant cities, suitcases rolling against the worn concrete. The air carried the scent of brewed coffee from the nearby kiosk, blending with the metallic tang of train tracks and the faint whisper of old stories left behind by travelers who had come and gone. Yet, in the midst of this constant movement, there was one figure that never left. Every morning, just as the station awoke with life, a lone German shepherd took his place at the entrance. He would settle down with a quiet grace, his thick black and tan coat blending against the weathered stone steps. His amber eyes would scan each face in the crowd, searching, always searching. And then, when the last of the passengers had departed, he would lower his head, sighing softly, as if resigned to another day of waiting. The station workers had taken notice of him early on. Some assumed he was a stray, wandering in from the nearby streets, but his disciplined posture and intelligent gaze told another story. This was not a dog lost or abandoned. This was a dog waiting. An old station master, Mr. Fletcher, had been the first to take pity on him. In his years working at the train station, he had seen countless people come and go, but never had he seen such unwavering loyalty from an animal. "You're a good boy," Fletcher would say each morning, unwrapping part of his ham sandwich and offering a piece to the dog. "Must be waiting for someone real special." The German shepherd, whom they had started calling Bruno, never accepted the food right away. He would always look toward the station entrance first, watching as the doors slid open and people stepped out. There was always a flicker of hope in his eyes. And then, as if realizing that today was just another day without the one he sought, he would lower his head and take the offered food. It had been months now. Rain, wind, and even snow had come, yet Bruno never left his post. He endured it all, his loyalty like an unshakable force against the cruel passage of time. A new observer. One crisp autumn morning, Emily Reynolds found herself pausing in front of the station entrance, her gaze drawn to the lonely dog sitting on the worn steps. She had seen him before, everyone had, but today something made her stop. Bruno was staring at the newly arrived train, ears pricked, tail motionless. His entire body seemed to hold its breath as the doors slid open and the passengers began to spill out onto the platform. One by one, they passed him without a second glance. A businessman adjusted his tie as he strode past. A mother held onto her child's hand. A teenager tapped away at his phone, all of them too caught up in their own worlds to notice the silent guardian in their midst. And then, as the last passenger stepped off and the doors slid shut once more, Bruno exhaled, his head lowered, his shoulders sagging just slightly. Emily felt a strange heaviness in her chest. She had never seen an animal look so heartbroken. She knelt beside him, her voice gentle. "Hey there, buddy," she murmured. Bruno flicked his ears in acknowledgement, but did not move away. Emily reached out cautiously, letting her fingers brush against his thick fur. He was warm, his body solid and strong beneath her touch. This was not a stray on the brink of starvation. This was a dog well fed enough to survive but utterly lost in his own grief. "You're waiting for someone, aren't you?" she whispered. Mr. Fletcher, who had been watching the exchange, approached with his usual slow gait, hands tucked into his heavy coat. "He's been here since summer," he said, settling onto the bench beside them. "Shows up every morning, leaves when the last train goes." Emily looked at him in surprise. "And no one knows who he belongs to?" The old station master shook his head. "Not a soul." Her fingers absently stroked Bruno's fur. "He has to belong to someone. A dog like this doesn't just appear." Fletcher sighed. "That's what worries me." Emily bit her lip. "Have you tried taking him home?" "Oh, I've tried," the older man admitted. "Took him with me one night. He stayed by the door, didn't eat, barely drank. Come morning, soon as I opened the door, he bolted right back here, like nothing else mattered." The station was starting to quiet now, the rush-hour crowd thinning. The last of the morning commuters disappeared beyond the ticket counters, leaving only the occasional traveler passing through. Emily stayed for a while longer, watching as Bruno laid his head on his paws, his golden eyes still fixed toward the station's entrance. She could feel it, the weight of his sorrow, the silent plea in his unwavering gaze. And she couldn't help but wonder, who was he waiting for? A town's concern. Word of Bruno spread quickly among the locals. Some had taken to leaving food and water for him, while others made sure he was safe during bad weather. Yet despite their kindness, he remained distant, his loyalty tethered to someone who had yet to return. A few people tried to adopt him. A kind-hearted woman from a nearby bookstore had attempted to take him home, but Bruno refused to stay, slipping out the moment her back was turned. A retired police officer had tried as well, thinking the disciplined dog might take to a new owner. But no matter who took him in, he always found his way back to the station. "It's not just instinct," Fletcher told Emily one afternoon. "It's love." Emily had started stopping by the station more often, bringing fresh water and treats, but Bruno only ever took them when his silent waiting was done for the day. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, she found herself sitting beside him on the cold pavement. "You know," she murmured, wrapping her arms around her knees, "I think you're the most loyal soul I've ever met." Bruno let out a soft huff, the sound barely audible. Emily sighed. "I just wish I knew who you were waiting for." A deep silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of a departing train. She knew now, without a doubt, that Bruno's story was not one of a lost dog. He was waiting for someone he had loved, someone who had promised to come back. And yet, as the days turned into weeks, as the leaves fell and the cold began to creep in, one question lingered in Emily's mind. What if the person he was waiting for was never coming back? The first clue. It was on a particularly cold morning in November that the first clue to Bruno's past surfaced. Emily had arrived at the station early, her breath clouding in the air, when she noticed something different. Bruno was not just waiting, he was alert. His ears were stiff, his body tense. And then she heard it. A voice. Low, unfamiliar, but spoken with hesitation. "Bruno?" Emily turned sharply, her heart pounding. A man stood at the entrance of the station, his clothes wrinkled, his hair unkempt. His face was drawn with exhaustion, his eyes shadowed with something deeper. Bruno stood up slowly, his tail barely moving. Emily's breath caught. Could it be? She watched as the man took a step closer, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Buddy?" Bruno's body remained frozen, his golden eyes locked onto the man's face. And then, in an instant, everything changed. His tail wagged, his ears twitched. A breath of disbelief left his throat before he ran, straight toward the man. Emily's heart clenched as Bruno leaped, nearly knocking the man off his feet, his paws wrapping around him as a desperate whine left his throat. Tears slipped down the man's face as he buried his hands in Bruno's fur, his voice cracking with grief. "I'm so sorry, boy," he whispered. "I didn't mean to leave you." And just like that, the truth had begun to unravel. But what Emily didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The real story behind Bruno's wait was something far more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. The moment stretched between them, silent, raw, thick with unspoken emotion. Bruno clung to the man, his massive paws pressing against his chest, his body trembling with an emotion so powerful it was almost unbearable to watch. He whined, not in pain, but in something deeper, something only a creature of unwavering loyalty could feel. Longing, relief, heartbreak all colliding in a single moment. The man, barely able to stand under the weight of the German shepherd's embrace, buried his face into Bruno's fur. His breath hitched, his shoulders shaking. Emily felt frozen in place, her heart pounding as she watched the reunion unfold. But something wasn't right. Yes, Bruno recognized the man. Yes, this was the person he had been waiting for. But there was something else, something hollow in the man's eyes, something broken in the way he whispered apologies over and over into Bruno's fur. Who was he? And more importantly, why had he left? Mr. Fletcher had stepped outside by now, his usual warm demeanor shadowed with caution. The older man had seen the same thing Emily had, the unanswered questions in this stranger's expression. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man pulled back, his fingers still tangled in Bruno's thick fur. His eyes were red-rimmed, dark shadows beneath them, as if he hadn't slept in days. I can't believe you're still here," he murmured. His voice was hoarse, thick with emotion. Bruno only let out a quiet whine, pressing his head against the man's chest as though afraid he would disappear again. Emily swallowed hard before finally speaking. "Who are you?" The man flinched, as if only now realizing there were others around him. His tired eyes flicked to her, then to Mr. Fletcher, before falling back down to Bruno. A beat of silence passed. Then, softly, he said, "His name isn't Bruno." Emily's breath caught. The man ran a trembling hand through the dog's fur, his voice barely above a whisper. "His name is Max." For months, Max, had been waiting, holding on to a name that wasn't his, holding on to a past that no one had known. And now, finally, the truth was beginning to surface. But Emily had a sinking feeling that the truth wasn't going to be a happy one. A name, a past, a wound that never healed. The man exhaled shakily, as if trying to find the strength to speak. His fingers curled around the fur on Max's neck, grounding himself before lifting his gaze to Emily. "My name is Daniel," he said. "And this dog used to be mine." A heavy silence settled over them. The words should have been a relief. Finally, an answer to the mystery of why Max had waited at the station for so long. But Emily could feel it. There was more. She studied Daniel, his unshaven face, the deep creases of exhaustion etched into his skin, the weight in his posture. His clothes were wrinkled, his jacket slightly oversized, as if he had borrowed it from someone else. He looked like a man who had lost everything. Mr. Fletcher spoke next, his voice laced with quiet skepticism. "If he was yours, why'd he end up here?" Daniel flinched, as if the question had physically struck him. He let out a bitter breath, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I didn't leave him," he murmured. "Not willingly." Emily exchanged a glance with Fletcher before kneeling beside Max, gently rubbing his side. "Then what happened?" Daniel swallowed hard. His hand rested on Max's head, but his eyes remained distant, lost in memories. "We used to live in an apartment a few blocks from here," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't much, but it was home. Just me and Max. He was my best friend. My only family." Emily's chest tightened at the words. Daniel exhaled sharply, like the memory itself hurt. "I worked as a construction worker. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough for the two of us. Every morning we had a routine. I'd walk Max to the train station before heading to work. I'd tell him, 'Be good, buddy. I'll be back before you know it.' And every evening, he'd be right here, waiting." A small, pained smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "That was our life. And it was enough." Emily felt a strange warmth at the thought. She could almost picture it, Max as he had been, younger, tail wagging, waiting for his owner at the same spot every day, certain that he would return. But then the warmth faded. Something had changed. Something had gone terribly wrong. Daniel's expression darkened. His fingers curled slightly into Max's fur. "I got laid off," he said, voice tight. "It happened fast. One day I had a job. The next I didn't. And in a city like this?" His breath shuddered. "I started falling behind, missed rent one month, then another. I tried to find work anywhere. Day labor, cleaning jobs, anything to keep a roof over our heads. But it wasn't enough." Emily felt a sickening dread settle in her stomach. Daniel shook his head, his jaw clenching. "The landlord gave me an eviction notice. I begged for more time, but he didn't care. And then, one day, I came home, and the locks had been changed. A deep silence fell over them. Daniel's voice cracked. I lost everything, and I had nowhere to take Max. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. So what did you do? Daniel let out a shuddering breath, his entire body tense. I thought, maybe, if I could just figure things out, I could come back for him. I took him to a friend's place, a guy I used to work with. Asked him to watch Max for a week, just 1 week. His hands clenched into fists. But when I went back, he was gone. Emily's breath hitched. Daniel's voice was thick with guilt. My friend said Max ran away, that he must have been looking for me. I spent weeks searching, calling shelters, checking every damn street, but I never found him. Max had been looking for him. He had run, searching, desperate to find the person who had promised to come back, and somehow, someway, he had ended up here, waiting. Emily felt her chest tighten painfully. She looked down at Max, who was still pressed against Daniel's side, his breathing steady but deep, as if soaking in every second of finally being home. Mr. Fletcher let out a long breath, his gaze thoughtful. And where have you been all this time? Daniel hesitated, and then finally he admitted, homeless. The word was heavy, final. Emily felt her heart crack just a little. Daniel gave a hollow laugh, shaking his head. Life kicked me down and just never let me get back up. I tried everything, day jobs, shelters, anything. But once you hit rock bottom, it's hard to climb back up. Emily's throat tightened. She had seen homelessness before. She had passed people huddled under bridges, sitting outside grocery stores with empty coffee cups in their hands. But she had never thought about what came before, about the lives that had once been whole before everything collapsed. Mr. Fletcher sighed, rubbing his chin. And now, Daniel swallowed hard, now, I have nothing except him. He looked down at Max, his hand shaking as it ran through the dog's fur. But if he still wants me, I swear I'll never leave him again. Max let out a soft huff, his tail wagging once. Emily exhaled slowly, wiping at the corner of her eye. It wasn't just a story about a dog waiting for his owner. It was a story about two souls, both lost, both searching. And now, finally, they had found each other again. But something deep in Emily's gut told her. The story wasn't over yet, not even close. For the first time in months, Max didn't wait at the station. That night, he left with Daniel. Emily watched them go, a strange weight settling in her chest. The reunion should have felt like a perfect ending, a dog finding his owner after months of waiting. But something still didn't sit right. Daniel's words haunted her. Now, I have nothing, except him. The raw honesty in his voice, the way his hands had trembled against Max's fur, the exhaustion in his eyes, it all pointed to one unsettling truth. Daniel wasn't okay, and Emily wasn't sure Max was truly safe. A new life, an old battle. For the first few days, Daniel and Max were inseparable. He took Max to the abandoned lot where he had been staying, a small patch of concrete behind a rundown convenience store, hidden from the busy streets. It wasn't much, but it was something. He curled up with Max beneath the awning at night, his arm draped protectively over the dog's body. Max didn't seem to care where they were. He had his person again, and that was all that mattered. But Emily couldn't shake the worry gnawing at her. She started visiting the lot every afternoon, bringing food, sometimes for Max, sometimes for Daniel. At first, he resisted, his pride flaring at the idea of being helped. But hunger was a strong persuader, and eventually he accepted. Still, there was an unspoken darkness lingering in his gaze. Daniel didn't talk about the nights that left his hands numb from the cold. He didn't mention the shame that settled in his chest every time a passerby averted their eyes, pretending not to see him. But Emily saw it, and she also saw something else. The way Daniel's body stiffened every time Max turned toward the station, his ears perking up at the sound of a train whistle. The way his jaw clenched whenever someone passed by with a leash in hand, their dog trotting happily beside them. Daniel noticed it too, and one night, as he sat with Max beneath the flickering glow of a streetlight, he finally admitted what he had been too afraid to say. He was doing just fine without me. The words were quiet, almost lost in the distant hum of the city. Max lifted his head at the sound of his voice, his golden eyes locked onto Daniel's face. Emily, sitting nearby on the pavement, leaned forward. "Daniel?" He shook his head, staring at his hands. "I left him. I lost him. And somehow he still managed to survive. He still managed to be loved." Emily swallowed. "He was waiting for you." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, and maybe he shouldn't have." Max, sensing the shift in his owner's emotions, nudged his head under Daniel's hand, letting out a low, comforting whine. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing the dog's head. "You don't get it," he murmured. "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve him." Emily didn't respond right away, because a part of her understood. She had seen it before, the way people who had lost everything struggled to believe they were worthy of happiness again, the way guilt wrapped around them like chains, dragging them further down. She had seen it in her own father, after her mother passed away. She wasn't going to let Daniel drown in that same darkness. She took a breath. "Then earn it." Daniel blinked, his tired eyes meeting hers. "If you feel like you don't deserve him," she continued, "then prove yourself wrong. Make a new life. Fight for him the way he fought for you." Daniel's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to argue, but no words came. He looked down at Max, who had already decided for him. Because no matter what Daniel thought, no matter how broken he felt, Max had already forgiven him. And he wasn't going anywhere. The weight of the past. The first step was the hardest. Emily convinced Daniel to visit a shelter, one that helped people get back on their feet. It wasn't easy. Daniel resisted at first, his pride flaring up again. But Max needed him, and that was the only thing strong enough to break through his stubbornness. The shelter offered warm beds, job assistance, and counseling. It wasn't a miracle solution, but it was something. Daniel took it one day at a time. He found work at a construction site, not much, but enough to earn a little money. Enough to buy Max a proper meal instead of relying on scraps. And for the first time in over a year, he slept in a real bed. But ghosts didn't vanish overnight. Some nights, when the world grew quiet and the weight of the past felt unbearable, Daniel would sit outside beneath the streetlights, his head in his hands. And Max, faithful, patient Max, would press himself against his side, his warmth a silent reminder that he was still there, still waiting, still believing in him. A test of loyalty. It happened 2 weeks later. A man in a suit arrived at the shelter, his expression unreadable as he stood at the entrance. Daniel, covered in dust from work, barely noticed him at first. But then the shelter manager called his name, gesturing him over. "Daniel," the manager said carefully. "This is Mr. Carter. He's been looking for Max." The world tilted slightly. Daniel's heart clenched. "What?" Mr. Carter sighed, adjusting his tie. "I work with a German Shepherd rescue. Someone reported seeing Max at the station months ago. We tried to take him in, but he always ran. It wasn't until recently that I saw a post online. Someone mentioned you two were back together." Daniel's mouth went dry. Mr. Carter looked at Max, his expression softening. "That dog is special. He survived on his own for so long, and people cared about him. We even had families wanting to adopt him." Daniel's stomach twisted. Carter met his gaze. "So I have to ask you, are you sure you can take care of him?" Silence. The question burned, slicing through every insecurity Daniel had buried deep. Could he? Could he promise Max the life he deserved? Could he be the person this dog had waited so long for? His hands clenched at his sides. Emily, who had been listening nearby, finally stepped forward. "He never stopped waiting for Daniel," she said quietly. "I think that tells you everything." Max, as if sensing the tension, pressed himself closer to Daniel's side, and that was the only answer Carter needed. He smiled, nodding once. Then, take care of him. Daniel exhaled, his entire body sagging in relief. He reached down, running his fingers through Max's fur. I will, he whispered, and this time, it wasn't a promise made in desperation. It was a vow. The final test winter arrived, blanketing the city in a cold hush. Daniel had moved out of the shelter, renting a small room in a shared apartment. It wasn't much, but it had walls, heat, a door that locked. Max had a bed of his own now, though he still preferred to sleep beside Daniel's feet. But there was one final thing Daniel had to do. One evening, just as the sun dipped beyond the horizon, Daniel and Max returned to the train station. Max stiffened slightly as they stepped onto the platform, his ears flicking at the distant sound of a train whistle. This was where it had all started, where he had waited, where Daniel had left. Daniel took a deep breath and knelt beside him, gripping his collar gently. "Hey, buddy." His voice was soft, careful. "You don't have to wait here anymore." Max tilted his head, his amber eyes searching Daniel's face. Daniel smiled. "I'm right here, and I'm never leaving again." For a long moment, Max stared at him. Then, as if understanding, he let out a soft huff and leaned against Daniel's chest. Not waiting, not searching, just home. The station was quiet that evening, the usual rush of passengers long gone. The air was crisp, the sky painted in deep shades of twilight, the last remnants of the sun slipping beyond the horizon. The hum of an approaching train echoed in the distance, but Max didn't react the way he used to. For months, he had stared at those tracks with endless hope, believing that every train carried the person he had lost. But now, as Daniel knelt beside him, gripping his fur gently, there was no anticipation in his eyes, no waiting, no searching, just understanding. "I'm here," Daniel whispered, his voice carrying the weight of everything he had lost and everything he had fought to reclaim. "You don't have to wait anymore." Max huffed softly, his body pressing against Daniel's. A silent promise. A vow of loyalty, not built on waiting, but on presence. Emily watched from a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself as the cold wind pressed against her. She had known from the start that this story wouldn't be simple. Max's wait had not just been about longing, it had been about survival, about holding on to something in a world that had taken everything from him. But now he had what he was looking for. Yet as much as Emily wanted this to be the perfect ending, something in her gut told her it wasn't over yet. Because the past doesn't let go that easily. And for Daniel, the past was coming back whether he was ready or not. The visitor. The first sign of trouble came a week later. Daniel had been doing his best, waking up early for work, making sure Max was fed before heading to his shift at the construction site, coming home exhausted but content. It wasn't perfect, but it was a life, a real life, one he was trying to rebuild. Emily still visited, sometimes bringing dinner, sometimes just checking in. She knew better than to push him, but she also knew he wasn't fully convinced that he deserved this second chance. Then, on a cold December evening, someone knocked on his door. Daniel had just finished washing up. Max sprawled on the floor beside him, tail thumping lazily against the floorboards. He hesitated before opening the door, his gut tightening with unease. When he did, his blood ran cold. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was a man he hadn't seen in over a year. His former landlord. "Well, well," the man said, leaning against the doorframe. "Look who finally crawled back up." Daniel's grip tightened on the door. "What do you want?" The landlord smirked. "I heard you got back on your feet. Got a job. A place. A dog that people won't shut up about." His eyes flicked down toward Max, who was now on his feet, ears pinned back in warning. Daniel's stomach twisted. "What's it to you?" The landlord let out a low chuckle. "You owe me money, Daniel. Remember? Back rent." The damages. Daniel clenched his jaw. I don't have anything for you." "Oh, I think you do." The smirk widened. "Word is, people were willing to pay good money for that dog of yours when he was out on the streets." A sickening chill ran down Daniel's spine. Max let out a low growl. "You wouldn't," Daniel said, his voice dangerously low. The landlord shrugged. "Wouldn't I? A purebred German shepherd with loyalty like that? People would kill for a dog like him." He leaned in slightly. "So, either you pay up, or maybe Max finds himself missing again." The world narrowed in an instant. Daniel's hands curled into fists, his heartbeat a deafening roar in his ears. He had spent so long trying to rebuild, trying to prove to himself and Max that they were safe now. But safety was a fragile thing. And now, someone was threatening the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. Max had waited for him. Now it was Daniel's turn to fight for him. A choice in the dark Emily arrived at the apartment later that night to find Daniel pacing, his fists clenched, his body rigid with tension. Max was alert, his gaze flicking between Daniel and the door, as if sensing that something was wrong. "What happened?" Emily asked, concern threading through her voice. Daniel didn't answer at first. Then, without looking at her, he muttered, "Someone's trying to take Max from me." Emily stiffened. "Who?" He let out a bitter breath. "My old landlord. Says I owe him money. Says people were trying to buy Max when he was on the streets, and now that I have him again." He swallowed hard. "He thinks he can take him." Emily felt her stomach drop. "He can't," she said firmly. Daniel let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah? And how do I stop him? I don't have savings, I don't have power. The system isn't exactly in my favor." Emily crossed her arms. "Then we don't go through the system." Daniel finally looked at her. "We fight this," she said. "We make sure he knows that Max is yours, and you're not backing down." Daniel hesitated. The weight of years of failure, of loss, of feeling like the world had already won, made it hard to believe in a fight he could actually win. But then he looked at Max, at the dog who had never given up on him, and something inside him hardened. This wasn't just about a debt. This wasn't just about survival. This was about proving, to himself, to Max, to the world, that they weren't victims anymore. They were a team, and no one was taking that away. A stand against the past. The landlord came back the next night. But this time, Daniel was waiting. He stood outside his apartment, Max sitting beside him, his stance firm. Emily was close by, phone in hand, ready to record if necessary. The landlord smirked as he approached. "You got my money?" "No," Daniel said. The smirk faltered slightly. "Then you know what that means." Daniel took a step forward. "It means you're not touching my dog." The landlord scoffed. "You really think you can stop me?" Daniel didn't blink. "Try." Max let out a deep, rumbling growl. Not aggressive, but firm. A warning. The landlord hesitated. His gaze flicked between Daniel's unwavering stance and the dog beside him, muscles coiled, eyes sharp. Emily lifted her phone. "Everything's being recorded," she said coolly. "So go ahead. Let's see how much you like explaining to the cops why you're trying to steal someone's service dog." The landlord sneered. "He's not a service dog." "He is now," Emily shot back. "Paperwork's already in process." A lie. But one that worked. The landlord's expression twisted in frustration. For a long moment, tension crackled in the air. Then, with a sharp huff, he muttered, "Not worth the trouble." And just like that, he turned and walked away. Emily let out a slow breath. Daniel's body finally relaxed, his hands still shaking with adrenaline. He looked down at Max, who was still alert, still watching, still ready to protect. Daniel knelt beside him, gripping his fur. "We did it, buddy," he whispered. Max licked his face, tail wagging, not waiting, not searching, just home. And this time, nothing was going to take that away. The train station was behind them now, but the echoes of its past remained. For months, it had been a place of waiting, a place of longing, a place where an unwavering bond had been tested by time, distance, and heartbreak. But now, As Daniel and Max walked away, it was no longer a place of ghosts. It was simply a memory. Max no longer scanned the crowd, searching for the face he had been so desperate to find. His steps were lighter, his tail wagging in an easy rhythm. He wasn't waiting anymore, because he had finally come home. The weight of the past, the promise of the future. Daniel had spent so long carrying his failures on his shoulders, letting them weigh him down until he felt like he could barely breathe. Losing his job, losing his home, losing Max. The guilt had consumed him, whispering in the back of his mind that he wasn't worthy of a second chance, that he wasn't worthy of loyalty, of love, of a life beyond the wreckage of his past. But Max had never believed that. Even when Daniel had disappeared, even when the world had turned cold, Max had waited. Not because he was lost, but because he still had hope. And if a dog could believe in him, maybe it was time for Daniel to start believing in himself. That night, as they reached their small apartment, Daniel let out a slow breath. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of distant rain, the city humming softly around them. For the first time in what felt like years, he didn't feel like he was drowning. He was standing on solid ground. Max nudged his leg gently, golden eyes looking up at him with quiet understanding. Daniel smiled. "Yeah, buddy," he murmured. "We made it." And this time, he wasn't afraid of what came next. Finding strength in the routine. The following weeks were unlike anything Daniel had experienced in a long time. For the first time in over a year, he had a routine. He woke up early, greeted by the weight of Max sprawled across his feet, the dog's slow, steady breathing, a reminder that he wasn't alone. They went on morning runs together, Max bounding ahead, his energy boundless, his spirit unbroken. The wind whipped through Daniel's hair, filling his lungs with cold air, but instead of exhaustion, he felt something else: freedom. At work, he pushed himself harder than ever, determined to make this second chance count. His boss at the construction site noticed, throwing him more responsibilities, hinting at a possible full-time position. Daniel didn't get his hopes up, but for the first time, he allowed himself to want it, to want something more. In the evenings, Emily stopped by, always with a sarcastic remark and a bag of takeout. "You look like you're actually sleeping these days," she teased one night, tossing him a burger. Daniel smirked. "Shocking, I know." Her gaze softened. "It's good to see." He glanced down at Max, who was gnawing contentedly on a chew toy Emily had brought. "I think it's because of him," Daniel admitted. Emily smiled. "Yeah, I think so too." The unexpected offer. It happened on a slow afternoon at work. Daniel was hauling supplies across the site when his boss, a broad-shouldered man named Carter, called him over. "Got a minute?" Daniel wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Yeah. What's up?" Carter studied him for a moment. "Been watching you these past few months. You work hard. Don't complain. Show up on time. Not a lot of guys do that anymore." Daniel wasn't sure where this was going. "I try," he said carefully. Carter nodded. "We're looking for a permanent hire. Benefits. Better pay. You interested?" For a second, Daniel's mind went blank. Permanent. Not just a temporary gig. Not just something to scrape by. An actual future. He swallowed hard, something tight building in his chest. "Yeah," he said, voice steady. "I'm interested." Carter clapped him on the shoulder. "Good, you earned it." As the older man walked away, Daniel stood there for a long moment, letting the reality of it settle in. For so long, he had been convinced he didn't deserve stability, that he would always be stuck, always struggling. But now, for the first time, he could see a way forward. That evening, when he got home, Max greeted him with an enthusiastic bark, tail wagging wildly. Daniel knelt down, wrapping his arms around the dog's sturdy frame. "We did it, buddy," he murmured. "We really did it." Max licked his face, letting out a happy huff, and Daniel knew, no matter what happened next, they were going to be okay. A home worth fighting for spring came early that year. The air was warmer, the days longer. Life had settled into something steady, something real. Daniel had moved into a slightly bigger apartment, a place with a small yard where Max could roam freely. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. One afternoon, as Daniel sat on the porch sipping coffee, he watched Max roll happily in the grass, kicking his legs up in sheer delight. Emily plopped down beside him with a sigh. "That dog is ridiculous," Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, and he's perfect." She nudged him playfully. "So what's next?" Daniel exhaled. "I don't know, but for the first time I'm excited to find out." And he meant it, because for the first time in years he wasn't running from the past. He was walking toward the future, and Max would be right there beside him, just as he always had been. The world kept moving, as it always did. Trains arrived, people hurried from place to place, conversations rose and fell like waves. Life went on. But for Daniel and Max, everything was different now. They were no longer waiting, no longer searching. They had found their way home. The strength of a second chance. Some nights, Daniel still lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts drifting back to the past, to the days when he had nothing, to the months when he had been lost, to the moment he had returned to the train station, fearing that Max would no longer remember him, only to find that Max had never stopped believing in him. That realization still hit him like a punch to the chest. Because how many people would have waited that long? How many would have stayed? Max had never given up on him, and Daniel swore he would never give up on Max. The weight of that promise settled deep in his bones, because second chances weren't given. They were earned, and Daniel was going to make sure that this one counted. A story that needed to be told. It started with a simple thought. People needed to hear this, not for attention, not for sympathy, but because stories like this mattered, because loyalty like Max's deserved to be known. One morning, as they sat outside their apartment, Daniel pulled out his phone. Max was stretched out on the porch, enjoying the morning sun, his tail flicking lazily against the wooden planks. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before snapping a picture. Then he began to type. "For months, this dog waited for me. Through the rain, the cold, the scorching heat, he never left. Because he believed I would come back. I lost everything, my home, my job, and for a while, I thought I had lost him too. But I was wrong. He never stopped believing in me. And now I'll spend the rest of my life proving that he was right too." He stared at the words for a long time before hitting post. Then he put his phone away and forgot about it. The message that changed everything. Daniel didn't expect much to come from it. He wasn't the type to share his life online. But somehow, his words found their way to people who needed to hear them. Within hours, the post started gaining traction. Within days, it had spread further than he could have imagined. People from all over shared their own stories, of dogs who had waited, of pets who had saved them, of second chances that had changed their lives. Strangers reached out, offering kindness, support, encouragement. Animal rescue groups shared Max's story, using it as a testament to the unwavering loyalty of dogs. Even the news picked it up, reaching out to Daniel, wanting to hear more. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, not just as a man who had fallen, but as someone who had fought to stand again, and as someone who had been worth waiting for. More than just a dog, Max didn't care about any of it. He didn't understand the thousands of likes or the messages flooding Daniel's inbox. To him, life was simple. All that mattered was that Daniel was here now, that their world had finally settled into something steady, that every morning he woke up with his person beside him. Daniel often found himself watching Max, amazed by the simplicity of his happiness. No grudges, no fear of the past, just trust, just love. And it made Daniel wonder, why did humans make things so much more complicated? Why did they struggle to forgive themselves when a dog could do it so easily? Max had never once asked him to be perfect. He had only ever asked him to stay. and Daniel knew, with absolute certainty, that he would. A home worth fighting for months passed, and life continued moving forward. Daniel's job became permanent, his boss impressed by his work ethic and dedication. He and Max moved into a larger apartment. Not fancy, but a place where Max had space to run, where they didn't have to worry about scraping by every month. And more than anything, it was theirs. One evening, as Daniel stood outside watching the sunset, Max sitting faithfully beside him, Emily pulled up in her car. She stepped out, arms crossed, giving him a once-over. "You look settled," she teased. Daniel smirked. "I think that's a good thing." Emily smiled. "Yeah, it is." She sat beside him on the porch, watching as Max stretched out, lazily rolling onto his back. "You ever think about what's next?" she asked. Daniel took a deep breath. For so long, he had only thought about surviving, about making it through one day, then the next. But now? Now he was starting to see beyond that. "Yeah," he admitted. "I do." Emily grinned. "That's progress," Daniel chuckled. "Guess it is." And for the first time, when he thought about the future, he wasn't afraid, because he wasn't alone anymore. He had a job, a home, a friend who refused to let him disappear, and a dog who had never stopped waiting. Not waiting, just living. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, Max curled up beside him. He reached out and rested a hand on the dog's back. He thought about everything they had been through, the nights on the streets, the waiting, the loneliness, and how, despite all of it, they had still found their way back to each other. "We're okay now," Daniel murmured. Max sighed in response, content and safe. Daniel smiled. For so long, Max had waited. For so long, Daniel had felt like he wasn't enough. But now, neither of them were waiting anymore. They were just living. Together. And this time the future felt limitless.